A Handbag Full of Caterpillars, Life as a Dartmoor Pagan. I had a good war, people would say, when they had thrived in times of conflict that otherwise blighted the 20th century. I always thought this was an odd concept until we experienced the COVID pandemic, and I too experienced a good lockdown. Having left my home on Dartmoor aged 18 in search of adventures, and having been convinced that excitement existed anywhere outside of it, I spent several decades in London. I explored everything the metropolis had to offer and felt an intense wraith for Dartmoor every day. When the pandemic happened, I found myself at the crossroads where several things were ending in my life. My marriage, my academic studies, and my conventional office-based world. When the instruction came to start working from home, I took that instruction to heart. I was suddenly free to make some choices, and so with a little unnecessary trepidation, I came home to Dartmoor. I have a lot to thank London for. I left with a love of many cultures and their food that share the space, a PhD in creative writing, and 20 years of witchcraft training, but I also had a greater understanding of my own culture and the land that brought me up. And by the way, yes, you read correctly, I trained as a Wiccan priestess while I was away. Sometimes it's referred to as modern pagan witchcraft. If you haven't encountered it, Wicca is a nature-based faith where we find communion with the divine in nature. It's not surprising really, when I grew up on Dartmoor, that this would be the life path that would make more sense to me. I grew up nestled between the tors and the agricultural land, immersed in nature, and I never quite fitted in living in the urban landscape. I've always said that London was my home while I was there, but Dartmoor was my soul's home, and my rural self leaked out of every pore. Spare a thought for those I shared an office with, as they had to put up with my lots of peculiarities. My desk was home to a little stealth altar to various pagan gods, a few choice lumps of Dartmoor quartz, and a variety of things collected on my lunchtime forays into the natural spaces of the city. The odd oak leaf had fallen from above, seemingly in answer to a question I now would put out to nature, while sitting on a park bench. Or the odd piece of piebald tree bark reminded me that, just like the magical London, plain trees, we too can slough off layers to let the emotional pollution go. There were the trails of mud that led across the office floor, leading somewhat accusatory to my desk. Then there was the time I accidentally came back to the office with a handbag full of caterpillars when they proceeded to escape. Mapping a path. At various times on this path through life, I have tried to affix various labels to myself to define my identity. Rural at source, child of Dartmoor, solitary witch, hedge witch, Wiccan, nature mystique. All of them are ways of describing one need at heart. I am someone who expresses my spiritual and creative life by a connection with nature, and through nature, I connect with the divine. When I'm cut off from it, I lose my sense of self and belonging. Whilst looking after a friend's esoteric bookshop in Bloomsbury one day, a young seeker came in, full of questions and curiosity about witches. It is only to be expected at the shop, which functioned as a part bookshop, part community centre. "Are you a witch?" she asked, and before I could swallow my teeth and answer with a reply along the lines of, "Well, that's a personal question," she followed with, "How can you be a witch when you live in the city?" It was a very simple question, but one I often return to, like a variation on Granny Weatherwax or Lolly Willows. Witches live in cottages in the countryside, on the edge of woods, don't they? My kitchen may have had lots of strange-looking jars of herbs, and it still does, but there was no cauldron bubbling over on an open fire. Wood fires continue to be frowned upon when our cities still remember choking under the weight of the smog that used to hang over them. Yet here is the thing that live witches have in common with other literary cousins and counterparts. We do tend to live on the outer edges of society and not just geographic ones. One of my oracle decks has a card that advises the querents to inhabit the modern world as if it was a cloak worn loosely around the shoulders. It means we can put this on and off at will, and if, like me, you are somebody with a moorland heart, this is the best way to live in the 21st century. The urban spaces are there to be stepped in and out of at will, and whenever I go to them, I am counting the minutes until I can come home, and each time I can choose how much of the real world I can drape around my shoulders. Don't get me wrong, my day job is very grounded. I work for a large drug and alcohol treatment charity, so there are not many fluffy bunnies in my working life, but it helps to realise that the world is full of in-between places that we can step into for refuge and draw on for strength and healing before we step back into the modern world to do the work that we are called to do. If you live in a town, you might need to be more observant, more alert to the subtlety of its presence that you might be in a rural setting. You must actively seek it out. Where I grew up on the highest point of Dartmoor, I couldn't help but be consciously aware of nature every minute of the day. Every window of the house looked out on fields with the beautiful granite tors as their backdrop. At night, the roof slates rattled in the wind, and a stream sang its way down past the house. When I stepped out of the door, there were birds, foxes, and rabbits, deer, sheep, cows, and ponies to encounter. By the time I reached the car, the weather had already imprinted itself on me, usually when my nicely blown dried hair was blown sideways. Even my wardrobe had to be different. Everything about my life on the moor screamed the power of nature with me. It's not a wonder I grew up as a pagan. It was almost inevitable. But rural life can be hard, both physically and economically, and is only sustainable if you can financially support yourself there, or are prepared to travel great distances to find work, or to work in unusual ways. Growing up, my daily commute to school was 28 miles away. Now I simply have to step from the kitchen into my study to find myself at work. Since the Industrial Revolution began in the 1700s, right up to the pandemic of 2020, most of us, for economic or familial reasons, had chosen to live in the more metropolitan spaces. So how do we create a modern life that still resonates with us spiritually and give us the peace we all crave? In the hands of humans, rewilding and sculpturing the landscapes. At a surface level, life in this city couldn't be more different than my childhood, but the golden threads of my upbringing still bound me together whilst I was there. I may not have had a garden, and I may have chosen to forego a car and instead use public transport because I could in the city, but I still had the same awareness of nature that I ever had. I still looked to the sky for a connection to the elements. I still had a mindful respect for the nature around me. Even at the subliminal unconscious level, the most staunchly urban dwellers still seek time in nature. If you don't believe me, then just visit a city park on a fine day at lunchtime. You will barely find a square inch of grass that doesn't have some city worker or lawyer draped across it. It seems they too were seeking peace, refuge, escape, and healing in natural spaces, and they need it in order to survive the bustle and noise for the rest of the day. It is those pockets of green that keep people sane. In a city park, just like in the rural landscape, you can commune with numerous species. Planes, oaks, maple, and some more unusual species which were placed there at a time when wealth was demonstrated by tree planting, instead of tax avoidance and conspicuous consumption. It is easy to imagine our urban green spaces are a poor relation to our national parks and other rural spaces, but just how much of the moorland landscape is untouched by human hands? We might be tempted to write about a completely free and untrampled landscape, but a brief glimpse beneath the surface reveals a less than wild history. The High Moor is littered with industrial ruins, tin mining pits, gunpowder towers, and the various dwellings that these industrial folk would have lived, worked and socialised in. The evergreen forests that now cover great swathes of the land were planted in almost living memory. I have photographs of my grandparents hiking through the waist-high pines, which now tower above us. And one of the original foresters I knew as a child expressed regret at his involvement with the plantations. They are quick-growing species, which is why they were planted by the Forestry Commission. And by the same token, the large areas are frequently cut down, leaving a wasteland that takes several years to recover. Today, the landowners carefully manage the landscape, burning back the gorse and the heather in the annual swaling to encourage better grazing for their livestock. But human interference is having a toll on the non-human life that tries to survive alongside us. This has led to a reduction in the amount of plant species that are visible, and in turn this is affecting our birds and other wildlife, leading the nature campaigner, Tony Whitehead, to declare Dartmoor is now a bleached out dead zone, as we have lost much of our healthy peat, heather and bilberry, the very things that we have come to associate with the high moor. While there are campaigns afoot to encourage the rewilding of our landscape, it will take generations of work to return the land to its original natural state. But first we must have to agree on what that natural state is. And even then, this regenerative process would need to be engineered by human hands. While I don't claim to know the rights and wrongs of how we manage our natural world, and if we filled a room full of ecologists, experts and pagans, I am sure there would be a million and one debates on how we should preserve our surroundings. But what I do know is this: we need to do something to support nature instead of destroying it, and also to remember that we are nature. It isn't something that exists outside and separately of us. We are not just outside of her either. For some of us, this permeates on a spiritual level, not just a financial or ideological one. Whilst we must find the spiritual path that works best for us, that allows us to connect with the divine in whatever form we worship it. For me, while I may dance under the full moon with my coven, a spaniel, a waterproof coat and a pair of walking boots is equally as important in my spiritual life as my athame and my pentacle. And sadly for my work colleagues, I will always be the person who occasionally brings a handbag full of caterpillars into the office, accidentally captured and later released whilst gathering some plant life on my lunchtime forays. More frequently though, I find myself capturing this on social media rather than in person, and I can't help feeling sad that so many people only get to see those caterpillars at a distance.